Abstract Expressionism is considered to be America's most important contribution to modernism, with its simplicity yet deep meaning in its pieces. It's best known for being very large and breaking away from traditional art styles. In 1929, the Museum of Modern Art opened in New York, and it gave room for more open art styles. During that year, the term abstract expressionism was said to be coined by Alfred Barr, yet that was not the official beginning of the movement. The term was first used in 1930 in Germany, and it was connected to the Russian artist Wassily Kandinsky to reference expressionist Germans and their anti-figurative aesthetic. Soon after, in 1940, the movement began to emerge in New York, mostly in Lower Manhattan, and it started small at first, and it was influenced mostly by Surrealism and Cubism. They combined abstract form and the expressionist emotional value of art. Other than New York, the art movement was in Europe, specifically in Paris. However, European artists began to move to America, specifically New York, just for the movement. Sometimes the movement was referred to as the New York School, or action painting. With the timing of the movement, it was after the Great Depression and the emergence of the Cold War politics, as well as social and cultural conservatism. At those times, regionalism and social realism were popular, yet soon became unsatisfying to people. The aftermath of the war brought light to the meaning of abstract expressionism. The artists were mostly influenced by surrealism, which translated into the new post-war mood of anxiety, trauma, troubled thoughts, awareness, and vulnerability. They, as artists, were not welcomed to the art scene at first with the economy and isolated culture. Recognizable names of this movement are Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, Franz Kline, Lee Krasher, Robert Motherwell, William Baziotis, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Adolf Goliath, Richard Posset Dart, and Clifford Still. A man named Robert Coates popularized the term for the movement when he applied it to artists like the very influential Jackson Pollock. The movement gained recognition because of Pollock's fame and his feature in Time magazine, which claimed him to be the greatest living artist in America. As a movement, the abstract expressionists were seen as rebels and troublemakers because of their change from the time's modern art. The truly unifying factor of all the artists was their exploration of the love for abstraction, making the viewer think twice when they looked at a piece. They celebrated spontaneous works and the exploration of the self-image in large paintings, with free form and gestural brushwork. Their work was seen as patriotic, romantic, and had a sense of freedom to most of the work. They wanted to make broad social statements without being incredibly provincial or being too political at the same time. Of course, they were not expressively political, yet they were sometimes held with Marxist ideas of social and economic equality. They could also be seen as very left-winged when it came to politics and brought hits of their views into their art. Their approaches involved complete freedom from all traditional aesthetic and social values, seeking free and personal expression with emphasis on dynamic, energetic gestures, and more open field of color. They put so much personal experience into their art, even if their viewpoint changed around a bit while they were making the art. They used their art as protest. Their influences also came from happier things than just the war. For example, Pollock and other artists said they had listened to jazz as they worked. It was very improvisational and expressive, just as they were. The movement encouraged exploration in anything and made artists stray away from more serious and cohesive styles, which finding it easy to display emotional depth in abstraction. They saw potential in everything for inspiration, especially old cultures such as Native Americans. It gave potential to color and meaning to become more intimate. They were at odds with society and were trying to break free and explore emotions that did not even want to be touched by the public. They were all committed to the expressive art, profound emotion, and universal themes.
All right, so the historical context of abstract expressionism is that it generally came from this collective mood of disparity post-war. Um, the New York School came about mostly as just this collection of all of the artists, but really you can't credit its formation or its existence to any sort of real unity between the people involving New York or America. It wasn't really about geography. It was about like the collective mood of this nation. There was post World War One, and a lot of people were just feeling really bad about society because of this the horrible war. And then even post World War Two, this just the crisis of that war and how horrible it was in terms of like the genocide just made all these artists, they wanted to express these societal concerns, but they wanted to do it without really being too visual. They didn't want to make it too obvious about what they were trying to say. Uh, um, uh, there's two main theses. One I'll discuss more in detail is uh, Goulbeau's thesis, French name, I can't really pronounce it, which is that it came from this post-war society and shifting political, social, and economic landscape. And Michael Leha, in his essay on the formation of the New York School, um, said it was retreating to the high ground and attending to the shared concern with adapting modernistic artistic practice to notions of human nature and mind undergoing urgent revision of culture, which is just this post-war ideas made people all just question everything and want to change everything, and they wanted to get simpler with it, and that's why there's complexity in Pollock's paintings, but really because of all like the splatters, but really if you think about it, it's all this simple idea of just pure human form and abstraction, and so that's where a lot of the abstraction came from. And um, it was an outgrowth of, I mean, also just the Great Depression happened, and so it was an outgrowth of how, really just depressing the Great Depression was, and all these artists they got when we were doing the New Deal with FDR. They got jobs in the Works Progress Administration, and that got them their jobs. But really, uh, a lot of people say that this is that abstract expressionism was like the first like purely American art movement. I think it's true in the fact that everybody was in America at the time, but if you think that every origin was American and it was this American thing, it really wasn't an American thing. Really, when you think about it, it was an extension of the what was going on in Europe with the avant-garde culture. And so you have these people over in Europe, and they're doing the same things because they had World War II over in Europe, they had World War One. The Great Depression was a global depression, so their economies are collapsing too. It's the same thing over there. And there's this avant-garde. And really, if you take just for an example, like Jackson Pollock, his mentor, he went over in Europe, he saw all of the avant-garde and the abstractionism happening there, and he brought some of those ideas back, and he became a pioneer in abstractionist in America. And so when people say that, it's true in that it was purely American, but really when you think about it, it's all just this outgrowth of it was a global trend in artistic culture towards in just like the mood of the artist was they all felt just really like messed up about how bad this whole thing was feeling. And so they wanted to make if you just bring it back to the American abstract expressionists, they wanted to make these like broad social statements, but they didn't want to be like political, and they didn't want to be provincial in their approach. And so they were trying to just create these simple things and let people interpret it. And really, if you think about it, that means it was part of also an outgrowth of Duchamp and it's all the same ideas. And so Michael Leha's thesis is that it's part of the motivation for constructing a unity from the population of the dispersed events that was the New York School has been the desire and need for these artists to be seen as an American representation of this European avant-garde. So that was really the historical context for it. And they assimilated this European modernism and made it into a uniquely American thing with the abstract expressionism, but it was still a representation of that. And that all came from the depression of the time, and the formation of the works progress gave them all their jobs, and then they got these jobs and they could focus on other things. And so they're creating their own work, but they want to represent all of this. And so that just is what leads all of them to all had this collective thing, which eventually led to the formation of the New York School, which was like Rothko, Klein, de Kooning, Pollock, all the big guys were all part of this big collective, and they had these talks, the Studio 35 talks, where they talked about what their ideas for it were. And so that was really the historical context of the movement.
Really, the biggest person I think you could probably say in all of the abstract expressionist art movement is Jackson Pollock, and he's very recognizable. He has style such as he's got the swirls everywhere. He was born in Wyoming, and he was one of the only abstract expressionists that isn't European, actually. I misspoke when I was recording the Rothko one, and I said, there's a lot of Americans. There really wasn't. And so he was fighting off that kind of the European assimilation into American, the American assimilation of European culture into the movement. And so he was one of the pioneers in the New York School, and he was really one of the first abstract expressionists. He started as a cubist and surrealist, and then he moved to abstract art. He was influenced by the American regionalism of his mentor, and he made a lot of these giant paintings on these huge canvases, but he didn't really actually sell any of them. They gained a lot of attention because people were talking about it because it's a very weird, and he was breaking a lot of boundaries and stuff, but he didn't sell any of them ever in his life. He struggled with alcoholism leading all the way up to his death, and he was influenced a lot by his wife, Lee Krasner, and so he was expelled from art school in LA, and he worked for a WPA, Works Progress Administration project, which is a example of how the New Deal and FDR helped lead to success of the movement. And so he experienced Native American culture, and you can see some influences of that because he had a great respect for that culture. He underwent Jungian psychotherapy to fight his alcoholism, and some concepts from that idea of therapy showed up in his work after therapy. People thought he probably had bipolar disorder, which can kind of explain if you have bipolar disorder. If you're having like some sort of manic or depressive episode, sometimes you can do some very weird stuff. And if you look at Jackson's paintings, they're not exactly normal. So he really revolutionized the way the movement worked and painting in general worked. He used liquid paint for the first time in painting, and so he said he preferred to use house paints over watercolor and solid paints, just because he liked the texture and the thickness of them. And he used this same formula. He had like black lines to anchor the painting, and then he had this like established rhythmic unity. It doesn't look like it's like wrong, even though it's very weird. It's still, you can tell it feels complete in painting in a way, which is weird, but it makes a lot of sense really when you look at his paintings. He defined his style as action painting and thought it was essential to walk around and see paintings from all sides. So basically what he did, he just laid this canvas out on a concrete floor, and that was how he painted it. And you can see just a kind of a weird, interesting thing is you can always see handprints of him on his painting because he wanted to be a part of his work, and so you could see that was like his signature was a handprint. You could see that, and it just emphasized the flatness of the canvas and how it was all against that cement. Really, just made that, and so you can see, and again, he had a lot of Native American influence. He had influence from Europe, even though he was really one of the only real Americans in the movement. And so you can see all of that, and he's really the example of abstract expressionism. If you ask, you could ask a lot of people when you think of abstract expressionism, anybody who like understands, has a basic foundation, and the first person they're going to say is Pollock. So he's really the main guy, along with Mark Rothko, in the movement.
My home is in Springs, East Hampton, Long Island. I was born in Cody, Wyoming, 39 years ago. In New York, I spent 2 years at the Art Students League with Tom Benton. He was a strong personality to react against. This was in 1929. I don't work from drawings or color sketches. My painting is direct. I usually paint on the floor. I enjoy working on a large canvas. I feel more at home, more at ease in a big area. Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I can walk around it, work from all four sides, and be in the painting, similar to the Indian sand painters of the West. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can. I like to use a dripping fluid paint. I also use sand, broken glass, pebbles, string. A method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. Technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. When I am painting, I have a general notion as to what I am about. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident, just as there is no beginning and no end. Sometimes I lose a painting, but I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
After Pollock, William de Kooning is seen as one of the most prominent names in the abstract expressionist movement. His paintings were of the movement, but were also mixed with Cubism, Surrealism, and just Expressionism. He was most well known for a series of paintings of women and traditional styles of anything that interested him. He is also known for his paintings of landscapes that were also popular because of his talent and name. De Kooning is actually a Dutch-born painter, born in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, in 1904. From a young age, he took art seriously, dropping out of school at the age of 12 to pursue in decorating and commercial design. He began to take night classes at Rotterdam Academy of Fine Arts and Techniques a few years later and started his first job at the age of 16 with an art director of a large art store. In 1926, he left for New York at the age of 22 and was influenced by the creative and open style and that the city had to offer. He began to develop his own artistic style at this time and with figure painting, and then began to become more abstract as time went on. He worked various jobs as his friends, such as Pablo Picasso and Joan Miro, encouraged him to paint for himself. In 1935, he was given the opportunity to work as an artist for the WPA, or Works Progress Administration. The hard work eventually paid off when, in 1936, his work became part of the MoMA. Sadly, however, he was forced to resign from the WPA because he was not an American citizen. Soon after that, de Kooning began his series of paintings that became very popular. His first were male figures, which then switched to women figures. Later on in his life, in 1943, de Kooning married Elaine Fried, who was his model for his painting Seated Women. The two had a very strange and angry relationship, which was mixed with lots of alcohol, and only 7 years lasted. Later, in 1950, they divorced. However, during the mid-1970s, they got back together for the remainder of their lives. As time went on, de Kooning began to branch out to more abstract work, as well as landscapes. He began to incorporate more people into his work. His artwork became more and more popular, and it landed him a central position in the movement. In the 1950s, he began to turn to abstract landscapes and continued to paint into his old age, as his mind was affected by Alzheimer's disease. He was granted American citizenship in 1961 and passed away in 1997 at the age of 92. With de Kooning, his ideas were very stretched. He opposed the thought of naming movements and restricting yourself with art because of one. He is considered an abstract expressionist and kept that style for most of his career, yet he did not abandon other art styles. He was very influenced by Cubism and Picasso, blending colors and figures in similar ways. De Kooning also liked to leave things as if they were unfinished, as if the process of the painting were still moving and it left viewers thinking.
Mark Rothko is one of the main artists in the abstract expressionist movement, and he's really one of the iconic figures when you think about the movement and you think about how it works. He was born in Russia, and he moved to the U.S. in 1913, which is not really a common narrative for these people. A lot of them are American nationalists, or not nationalists. They were born in America, like Jackson Pollock, but he was from Russia, and he moved in 1913 to America. He went to Yale, and he found an interest in art because he just happened to find himself in a friend's art class at one point. And he had this very strong love for theater, and he saw his paintings as like this drama, and he wanted the subjects of his paintings to be performers, and he wanted it all to be very dramatic, which is interesting when you really look at his work, because it doesn't really look dramatic, but you know, he does have a lot going on, but it's really under the surface. And that the way he makes his paintings is very weird. He just does layers and layers of colors until he has the right thing. So really there is a lot of not a lot of action, like if you were to compare it to Pollock, where he's got all the spirals and everywhere. But it still has a lot going on in terms of the process of making it. He studied under a guy, Max Weber, earlier in his career. And Max Weber he went over to Europe, and he observed the avant-garde and abstractionism over there, and he brought that back and made it really uniquely American, and that really probably guided Rothko's change. He began as a realist painter, and he transitioned in 1929 to abstract expressionism after the Depression began and the realist era kind of ended. And people didn't really... I mean, I talked about it in my context, but it was like there's just all this depression, and people didn't really need to focus. They didn't really want to focus on it so much. I mean, they did, but they wanted to do it in a different way than how the realists did it. And so he supported himself by working odd jobs. He didn't have a works progress administration job like Pollock did. And he taught at a Jewish school until 1952. And there are some things he said about, he saw truth in children and their use of simple shapes and ability to communicate reality. And so he had an appreciation for the simplicity that he saw in children, and that really leads to a lot of his artwork, which is very simplistic and has very simple shapes. He has influence. You can see European influence in his work, and his first main exhibition in 1949 was called The Middle Ground Between Abstractionism and Surrealism, and really that marks the start of the abstract expressionist movement. So he was a real founding member. The work in the mid-40s were like vague forms and surreal, and the start of his real like signature was in the 1949 1950, and it's basically 3 rectangles on a color field, and it's really the same, but it's how he uses the colors and how he layers them and how he compares colors to one another. And so he got his first solo exhibition at MoMA in 1961, and then in 1964 he got a commission from a chapel in Texas, I believe, and he had this goal to be a part of religious art in the Western world, and so that really gave him that. He committed suicide in 1970 in his studio, and after that, but before that, he had he founded the Mark Rothko Foundation, which is really a way to establish his estate and what would happen with it after he was done. And he went back on the original plan and turned it into a society to give grants to unsuccessful artists. So he was really one of the main pioneers of the art of the movement, and he marked the beginning of it, and he had all this European influence, and he really was one of the first people to really combine the European influence and make it American. He was an immigrant. Mark Rothko is really one of the most important people in this movement. So that's his kind of deal.
So the piece I am going to analyze of de Kooning's is his piece Woman 1 from 1948. It is one of the major surviving pieces from his second women's series of paintings. It's currently in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It goes along with his other pieces named Woman 3 and Woman 5 and so on. All of the pieces in his Woman series look fairly similar to this one, and it matches their criteria. It has large eyes, a grinning mouth with really strange teeth showing, even it's a little bit violent, really. Very large and misshapen breasts. She has pink legs, and they come out of her little like fiery looking skirt, and all of her features are really exaggerated in an absurd way. The painting is said to be about de Kooning's sexual frustration towards women. He was on a subway, and he was looking at this very attractive woman across from him, and he was resisting so much urge I don't even want to describe, but yeah. And so the person in the painting is a woman from the subway. And as a person, he was very impulsive, and he kept things inside of him a lot, and he only like really brought it out in his paintings, and he was very crude when it came to other people, and he was able to get upset really easily. Like, for instance, if he tried to talk to somebody and he was accidentally ignored, he would be very upset. He was very powered with sexual desires, and they made up most of his meaning. of his women series. He painted what he could not say to these women. It is one of the very few erotic abstract expressionism pieces because most of it was about their experiences with the war, but he focused on other things like women and men and so on. So, de Kooning described it to not be delicate, but more as something he slapped onto the canvas to take out his feelings about the subject in some sort of way. It's all of the feelings on the canvas are his anxiety about women, and he just brought them all out. De Kooning was also, he's always very harsh with his brushstrokes and the colors, and they match and dissolve his subject on the canvas. For this one specifically, he uses warm colors to show the gender of the figure, and much harder colors surround her to show his emotion in the piece. For the brushstrokes, they show very fast and clumsy movement. They're kind of jagged. It kind of displays the anxiety and the pressure and the desire that de Kooning holds for these women, but he cannot show them. The work looks very fast and unsteady, but it is known that he did these pieces in stages and used various materials to overlap the strokes, so they're not that fast. They took time. This piece was actually abandoned at one point, so it took more than just 1948. It was released in 1950. Continued on. He didn't completely abandon it. He came back to it at various stages. For the materials, he used oil paints, and he used several different substances, such as titanium dioxide for black, zinc white, small amounts of cadmium yellow and orange, and iron oxide for several spots on the white. And the piece is known for having a lot of surface texture. It was painted on the rough side of a fiber board panel without any sort of ground layer, and he began to use coarse materials with his paints. As well as the paints, he used the small amounts of plaster for several parts of the painting, and the palette scrapings that he had left after he finished, he would just scrape them right onto the finished product, so there's little tiny flakes everywhere of dried paint. And with the features of this woman, the gritting teeth are used to symbolize the restraint that he had for the woman on the subway. The restraint that he felt, not her. The large breasts were to symbolize what he was mostly focused on. It was all that, I don't know, male testosterone. I don't know. And the fiery colors of the skirt were to show, I don't know, the heat. No, not the heat, but maybe like the oh gosh, the to show the passion that he felt inside, the desire, because most warm colors like red and orange are to show sometimes passion, not just love, or because obviously for this stranger in public, he didn't feel some sort of romance or love. Just passion, drive.
The painting from this movement that I'm going to be analyzing really in great detail is number one. It's either titled or subtitled "Lavender Mist" by Jackson Pollock. The title is kind of ambiguous, which really is Jackson Pollock in general. And so, if you look at this painting, you can see this is really classic Jackson Pollock. It was made. It's really big. The canvas is very large. It was made on cement. It was made with these liquid paints that he was really a big fan of. And you can see he has this anchor of black lines in it. And so those black lines, they crisscross the whole page, and they're not exactly in the forefront. The forefront is really the white and the purples and the browns, but the the anchor of the painting and the real backdrop of the painting is this kind of black foundation of lines. And so you can see just really elements of how Pollock painted. You can see he goes all the way around the canvas. There's paint that comes off the canvas. He doesn't really bother with starting or end points in this. And you can see this really looks like it was made in a really like almost schizophrenic way. And so it has these black anchors, but it has all these colors in the forefront that are just there's a mixture of colors that really gives this painting shape. And there's a lot of texture to it, and it has a certain rhythm that you can't really think about, but there's a completeness and unity to the painting. And this might go back a little bit to the so-called equation that there was that explains all of Pollock's paintings, because that was how most of them worked. But something about this painting is really obviously pulls itself together, and it has this sense of unity in these lines, even though really it's something that you can't really be explained. But it has this classic Jackson Pollock style, and it utilizes the innovations that he did to the movement. You can see obviously the liquid paint, which is something that he picked up at a Mexican conference with a Mexican artist, and it has a lot of these elements that he liked, and just these elements of the action painting, and how you can see that he takes this from all angles. He didn't paint this with it standing up, him sitting in a chair, painting it with a paintbrush on an easel on a framed canvas. This was done in a really raw way. He really stripped away the formality of creating artwork, and the guy in the beret sitting at an easel, painting with watercolors for hours on end. And he took that away and he said, let's do this in a simple way. But he ended up making something way more complex out of that simplicity. So he splatters paints everywhere, and it looks really complicated, but it's really simple because it's how he did it that is simple. That's where the simplicity of the movement in general, really the abstract expressionist movement, comes from. It's like it's done in ways that look simple, and I put air quotes around simple because there's a lot going on here. And there's mathematical equations, and I don't want to cross-analyze, but if you look at Rothko, there's different layerings, and this whole movement was just trying to put all this together in a way that was simple, but it opened up interpretation, but it allowed for pure expression of human thought. And when Pollock was talking about how he made these pieces, it was just he got out there and he started splashing some paints on this thing, and he said he would just get lost because he wouldn't really remember what he did. And that's where you see the handprints all over it, because he didn't really know what he was doing until he stepped back away from the canvas and saw what he made. And so Pollock's work has a certain raw quality to it that you can't really get in other artwork, and it has this raw, and it's complex, but it has this raw simplicity to it that you really can't see. And that's where a lot of the beauty in his artwork comes from. And so you can see just it's simple, really, when you think about his work. It's done in a simple way, even though it doesn't really look like that. It is really a simplistic set of work.
Abstract Expressionism was not an ideal label for the movement. It's somehow meant to encompass not only the work of painters who filled their canvases with fields of color and abstract forms, but also those who attacked their canvases with vigorous gestural expression. The movement had a large impact and marked the shift of the creative center of modern paintings. As a movement, New York was able to take the title of most popularized abstract expressionists from Paris. People were influenced by the art style and by its focus on what people are not consciously thinking of. Barnett Newman once said that we felt the moral crisis of a world in shambles, a world destroyed by a Great Depression and a fierce world war, and it was impossible at that time to paint the kind of paintings we were doing: flowers, reclining nudes, and people playing the cello. The people who started the abstract expressionist movement felt that they needed to change their art style to go with the times, to go with what they felt was most comfortable, I suppose. They changed, like most art styles do, most art movements do. By 1960, participants in the movement drifted away from the style and action painting, as most art movements go. However, even if the movement began to decline in popularity, it never did leave. Abstract expressionism comes in many forms, such as Kazimir Malevich's architecture. During the first half of the 20th century, artists were in many different mediums, and they began to use photography as the most progressive means of expression. Today, the art movement has spanned to photography and graphic design. Abstract expressionism was a short-lived movement, yet it had an influence on all the 60s art, such as Tackism, post-minimalism, neo-expressionism, and a lot more. It is ironic but not contradictory that in society, in which political repression weighed as heavily as it did in the United States, abstract expressionism was for many the expression of freedom, the freedom to create controversial works of art, the freedom symbolized by action painting, by unbridled expressionism of artists completely without feathers. To us, art is an adventure into an unknown world of the imagination that is fancy-free and violently opposed to common sense.